Welcome, this is Possibilities. My name is Cecil Walker.
And I am Adam Frower.
And today we're going to be chatting about screen addiction and maybe even how to find your way out of a screen addiction. You actually used to teach a class on addiction, didn't you? Can you help
I did.
give us perspective on what would you classify as screen addiction and what's the distinction you'd make there?
Sure. I've realized that because you always kick us off, I always have to answer the first question.
It's true. It's been working.
Next time, I'm going to cut in and be like, and I have a question for you.
You can try. We'll see what happens.
But I think typically the way that we describe addiction or classify something as an addiction is that, and it can be technically many things, right? Most things we could become addicted to according to the typical definition. And it's when something that we're using becomes problematic to us in some way. Typically it's taking up more of our, in this case, more of our time than we would want it to take up. In addition to that, it could have negative impacts on us, right? So it could harm our work, it could harm our social relationships, it could harm our health, right? So there are negative implications of continuing to engage in this behavior. If we talk about other kind of key elements of addiction, one of them is that it tends to be classified or made up of obsessions and compulsions, right? So obsessions being, I think about this, it takes a lot of time and energy to think about when I was using, in this case, when I was playing that game, when I was watching those episodes on Netflix or Hulu or whatever it is. So I'm kind of either reliving that experience or I'm planning how it is that I'm going to make time to do this again, or I'm going to actually spend the time doing it. So it starts to take up a lot of our time with this obsession of thinking about this, engaging in this behavior. The compulsion is I then engage in the behavior almost without thought. I by the time I realize that I've clicked on that next episode, I'm halfway through, and then I think, man, why did I do that? I didn't intend to do that. I was going to go do something else instead, right? So it's that compulsion where we engage in the behavior without really kind of consciously being aware, oh, I'm engaging in this behavior, or I'm choosing to engage in this behavior.
Yeah. What I've noticed too is that it's that compulsion that leads you to what seems to be another hallmark of addiction, any kind of addiction, is once you realize you're stuck in this, predicament, it's hard to stop. You can't even stop when you want to say, I would like to not spend as much time on my phone, on watching TV, whatever, surfing the internet, and then to see yourself struggle to maintain that as a result of that compulsion. I think that really kind of shows you, oh, this is different than this just happens to be how I'm spending my time. I'm kind of stuck in a rut.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I would compare that to, if we think about it in like chemical addictions, we think about it as like there's a tolerance, right? That over time I need more of the substance in order to get a similar high. It's similar with a screen addiction, right? Especially things like video games, right? I need a new level, or I need to conquer something that's even more difficult in order to get the same sense of satisfaction that maybe I did when I passed level 1, right? So my tolerance builds up. And then the other thing is withdrawal symptoms, right? Which is easy to think about when we think about chemicals, drugs or alcohol or those kinds of things, where if I stop engaging in the behavior, then I experience negative physical symptoms. And oftentimes this is connected to a physical dependency, right? I need this in order to not have a headache, or I need this in order to feel like I can function well. This is why people who drink a lot of coffee, they're like, I can't even get going in the morning without my cup of coffee. That there's a withdrawal symptoms of I start to get jittery, or I have low energy, or I get a headache, but also that physical dependence of like, I need this in order to feel like I can function in my normal way. And I think similarly with screens, right? People will say, I need to know what this episode is going to be about, or I need to know what the end of this show is in order to feel like I have a sense of satisfaction or completion or whatever. but oftentimes that isn't even enough. Then you need to go on to the next season, or you need, whatever it is.
Yeah, that I think really starts to depict an answer to this question of why might we want to cut down on screen time in the first place? Why might we want to consider doing something about how just intertwined with screens we are throughout the day, throughout the week? And just like you described, it can start to dig itself into just the way that you operate and function. It starts to feel like you're dependent on it, or it's changing really you and how you interact throughout the day in general. When I hear addiction, I always think of dopamine and dopamine systems in the brain. And what tends to happen with any kind of addiction is our bodies respond to those high levels of dopamine we get from these typically dependent things like screen time or drugs or alcohol or coffee or whatever. Even shopping can do it. Because you're flooding your brain with so much dopamine, your brain then starts to kind of react to that by maybe receiving less dopamine, trying to regulate how much it's letting in. And so what that does then is makes things seem kind of dull in general. You start to need certain amounts of dopamine in order to feel, the typical good response that you might have. Just like you were saying, then your tolerance starts to increase. But I think with things like social media, TV, these things that are just kind of everywhere, it's not just a tolerance that's built up for those specific things. It's kind of a tolerance for stimulation in general. It starts to seem like, nothing could be that exciting than if I'm used to watching something super, super exciting whenever I want at the drop of a dime, nonstop all night long. And so I think there is one of the biggest cases for why someone might want to reconsider how much time you're spending on your screens, what you're doing when you spend that time on the screens. Another question, if I can sneak it in, is what's the distinction you would make between the ways that people spend their time on their screens? Because I could imagine someone spending quite a lot of time on screens throughout the day, throughout the week, but it not being the same as I'm just scrolling through Instagram, I'm just watching endless TikTok videos, I'm just going through Netflix. It could be I'm studying, this is how I'm keeping in touch with family, I'm FaceTiming someone in another state, another country. How do you make these distinctions between what's healthy, what's not healthy?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and I think one of the things that I would say is there's kind of two components of this. Like, one is the context within which I'm considering the screen time, and I think you highlighted a bit of that, right? Am I using this to talk to my friends, to stay connected to my family members? Am I doing service work somehow through the computer? Am I right? So we wouldn't deem that as necessarily problematic. However, one of the criteria is it impacting your relationships? Is it impacting your ability to work? Is it changing your regular daily habits? Are you getting less sleep than you should be, right? So I think even those things that are seemingly good, if I do them too much or too long, it could potentially become problematic. One of the other things I think that's important is you look at then the outcome, right? And you say, is this outcome leading to something helpful, productive, useful, enjoyable even? Or is this outcome leading to something that is compromising, that's detrimental? And so I think, again, I can sit and watch a television show with my family, and that might bring us together. That might give us something to talk about. It gives us a shared experience together. I have kids and they like to play video games. So is it something that is creating, this is going to sound strange, but there is a lot of agility that needs to come from playing video games. There's a lot of problem solving skills that come from playing video games. If you're playing multiplayer games, there's a lot of communication skills that have to come. There's strategizing, right? So there are positive outcomes, but do those positive outcomes outweigh how much time you're spending? Or are you being, we've seen people who are malnourished because they're playing and they're not eating, or they're soiling themselves because they're not getting up to go to the bathroom, or they're clearly not getting enough sleep, right? So it's now compromising those positive benefits of communication, of relationships, of all of those things, it's no longer outweighing the negative impacts because it's becoming harmful to my body, to my social well-being, to my work environment, whatever it might be. So I think both that what's the purpose of this and what are the outcomes of this need to be taken into consideration when we think about, is this problematic or not?
It sounds very much like intention in this kind of helps create a distinction too. Not only are you choosing, I'm doing it for this amount for this reason, and here's how it contributes to my life, and I see that as being significant enough that it's worth the time that I give it. Not only are you choosing that, but you're also choosing to say, and here's how I'm going to draw the line. Here's where I'm going to stop and use my time for something else as well. So there's choice, there's intention, there's kind of some purposeful meaning making that happens with. Here's why I use it, and this is why it functions and works well for me.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and I think one of the things that we need to think about too is that screens, by and large, they're not problematic, right? Phones help us to stay in contact with one another. I mean, YouTube, we oftentimes talk about YouTube as like you just endlessly scroll or watch these videos, but I think how many tutorials are there that teach us how to do amazing things that we never could have considered taking on our own without those things, right? Things, and again, some people really like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok, and we use that sometimes as a source of entertainment, but we also use that as a learning opportunity. We have access to content that we never would have had access to in the days of an encyclopedia. All of that content couldn't fit into a book, right? And so I think we have to be careful to say, not say that screens are bad or that everything that comes from the screen is horrible. But I guess that then brings up the question of like, so if there is this potential for using it worthwhilely or letting it cross the boundary into becoming, problematic, how do you determine, am I crossing the line? Am I moving into a place of I was using it for a good purpose or something useful, and now it's just gone too far? How do you know?
Well, I think that goes, you used exactly the right word. You said purpose, and it speaks very much to purpose, and all the things that purpose is connected to, like your values and what's important to you, what's significant in your life. And maybe that sounds kind of grand and global, but when it comes to how are you spending the time, the hours in your day, I think that is something grand, that is something global, and that's something worth putting purpose into. And if you were to ask me just kind of blankly, what's valuable to you? What do you want to spend your time on? I don't think that my top 10 list would ever be, I want to make sure I spend this amount of hours watching YouTube videos, or I want to make sure I've scrolled until I've seen everything, on whatever app.
Is that possible?
Well, these days they'll make it seem fresh enough, but after a while you start to kind of feel like, there's nothing new happening, there's nothing new to be seen, if you spend enough time. But I think if you ask people that, any person in general, those wouldn't be the ideals that they really start to speak to, that's how they want to spend their time. Instead, they would say things like, I really want to make time for my family. If I could have this much time for my family, that would be amazing. I really want to make time for my hobbies, the things that I'm passionate about. Maybe even some like secret passions that I really want to expand on, or an idea for a business that I think I want to try to get off the ground. I really want to spend time on my health and physical activity. And so if you start to connect your actions to those values, you start to see yourself doing things differently. And I think that's worth looking at when you look at how much time you spend on your screens and say, how much of this is really purposeful stuff? How much is this connected to what I actually really want to see myself doing throughout the day? And I don't mean to totally villainize spending time on screens or social media even. I feel like there's function and purpose to that too. But once you get really intentional about it and start to assign that purpose and really evaluate that purpose, it can look very different. I think people would spend a different amount of time on TikTok, on YouTube, on whatever, if they really connected it to some sense of here's why I'm doing this. Here's how I want to be doing this, and how does that fit in with this, the pie of everything else that's significant to me.
So that brings up another question for me, which I think is what many people watching this video might be interested in, is like, I know what addiction is, I know that it's problematic, I know that I'm spending too much time doing these things that I don't want to do, watching this stuff that I don't want to watch. So if I find myself in this problematic place, how do I do something different if it comes down to obsessions and compulsions and something that I feel like I don't have control over, or something that just happens? How do I do something different about it?
I think there's a couple different ways to go about that, but the way that I've seen to be the most potent and effective way to do something about that is continuing on this idea of purpose. You kind of have to know your purpose in doing that. You say, I want to do something different. Well, what's the different that you want to do? What do you want to see yourself doing? Why do you want to see yourself doing those things? Why do any of these decisions even matter to you? And when people really slow down and give some thoughtful answers to those things, they come up with things like, I want to be a better dad, or I want to get really good at music because music speaks to me in this way or has this significance for me, and I need to really dedicate some time to that and sitting with that. Or I need to be more productive. I feel like I have a lot of potential that I'm just not reaching at my job or at my own personal business or my own hobbies or passions, whatever. And I just need to spend more time being productive in those things. So when people slow down and figure out what those things are that are important to them, that can really start to transform behavior. And then you have to connect it to these decisions that you're making. I know for a lot of people, I've heard from a lot of people in therapy, and I've even experienced it myself, one of the first things you do when you wake up is you check your phone. But what can happen is you kind of get stuck because phones are kind of made to hold you there. It's less of a just looking at what time it is when you wake up, and more of a, here's a long list of things that I'm about to do now on my phone. I'm going to go to this app and then to this app and check the news. I got these text messages. Someone emailed me while I was sleeping. All of these things start to happen, and then you're stuck in it. And it just feels like I'd rather stay there than do the work of getting out of bed and starting my day. But when I stop and I think of, what am I not doing by sitting here doing all this? I could read every CNN update that has happened overnight. I could, scroll through Twitter. I could answer all these emails that I have to answer. But what am I not doing with my morning that I very much would like to see myself doing? I value being physically active. So I could have been going on a run with this extra 20, 30, however many minutes that I wasted here. I really like to have a really peaceful and intentional breakfast. And that's stealing away from the time that I have for that kind of a thing. So once I get in touch with the purpose, the thing that's meaningful to me, the person that I want to be, the reasons that I want to spend my time a certain way, then I have to say, well, what decisions do I have to make that start to line up with that? And that requires a replacement of behavior. I think it starts to be, I want to put down my phone right now, not just because this is bad and I want to put it down, but because I'm actively choosing something else that's really important to me. I'm choosing these other ways to spend my morning, or these other values that I really want to contribute to in my life.
Yeah, you said some really, really important things in there, and I think I just want to highlight a few. I think one of the things that you kind of highlighted a couple of times actually is you would say like the required behavior change. Or altering the behavior. And I think embedded under that is if I come in and I say I don't want to spend all this time, or I feel like I'm stuck in this place I don't want to be, in essence what you're saying is I want something to change. I want something to be different. And I think that concept of change is so important, because I think sometimes when we think about addiction, we think about it as in static terms of, once I have an addiction or once I become an addict, I'm always an addict. AA is founded on that principle. Once an addict, always an addict. And I think one of the things that does is that it removes the possibility of change. And in your answer, you came back time and time again to, if I understand my purpose, if I understand the meaning that I want this life to include, then I have to make decisions that will alter my behavior. In some sense, I have to change. And I think that one of the very first bits of change is that we have to say change is possible, right? That I can move from being an addict or somebody who engages in this kind of behavior or who watches these things or whatever, to being a person who doesn't do it as much or who doesn't do it at all. Or so I think one of the shifts that we have to make is that we have to give up this static mentality of once I am engaged or once I'm this version of myself, I can't be another version of myself. So I think that's important, embedded in what you talked about. The other thing that you kind of highlighted again and again is that knowing your purpose or infusing meaning into what it is that you're doing and why you're doing it, right? I could either sit here and read all of these CNN notifications, or I could go have a peaceful, purposeful breakfast, right? And I think that when you lay out that dichotomy, then you have a decision to make. And I think we talked about this in one of our previous possibilities around attention and inattention or intentiveness. And one of the things that we talked about is there's always something vying for your attention. You can't not attend to something. And so being deliberate about where you put your intentions. When you're deliberate, then you can also make decisions beforehand, right? You say, okay, I know I'm the kind of person who wakes up in the morning and who picks up my phone because it's sitting right there. So maybe the intention starts the night before, where I put my phone farther away from me. Or maybe I go and buy an alarm clock so that it's now I wake up to the alarm instead of to the alarm on my phone. So I make decisions purposefully beforehand that will help me be successful in this particular endeavor. If it's I spend so much time on Twitter, right? Then perhaps I delete the Twitter app, or I set a limit on my phone. You can set a limit that says you get 30 minutes and then you shut it off. Then you have another decision to make it 30 minutes, because it also gives you the decision to override that, right? But you are intentional about putting parameters in place, knowing I am the kind of person who could get sucked in. I think the other thing that is really important in what you talked about is, in some sense, there is accountability, there's a responsibility. And sometimes when we're in this process of engaging in these behaviors, we've given up that accountability or that responsibility, and we just say, I can't do it. I'm not the kind of person who could put this down or who could stop or whatever. And I think if we get to that place where we feel like we're not the version of ourselves that could, then maybe we need to expand our circle and include other people to say, can you help me be responsible? Can you call me at such and such a time? Or can we go do something together instead of sitting around, right? So again, I think there's this intention, but it's not just intention to stop a certain behavior, but it's connected to what you were talking about around meaning making. Why do I want to stop this behavior? What kind of person do I want to be? How do I want to be spending my time? I have a limited amount of time. Where do I want to give it? And so I think sometimes in order to stop that obsession, we need to introduce other things to prevent that compulsion from happening. We put other contextual variables in place, right? One of the things about compulsion is I tend to use or do this activity in the same place. The environment is very much the same. The lighting is the same. The people who are there are the same. So it's a very contextual situation. So if we're intentional why do I keep saying that? Intentional about changing the environment, then that might inherently then prevent the compulsion from happening. So I think the way that we keep coming back to is we talk about like, what's your desired outcome? What do you want your transformation to be? What version of yourself do you want to be? And in essence, if we get back to how do you stop addiction? How do I stop using screens when I don't want to? Then you take stock of what version of myself do I want to be, and then you change the context so that those obsessions and those compulsions can't kick into play.
No, I think that's brilliant. All of these things you're describing to me just look like putting the pieces of this new reality into place. The context that you're finding yourself in, the purpose that you're connected to, the reasons why you're doing these things, what you're thinking about, and the decisions that you're making. It's like just piecing together something new, a new version of yourself. I know a lot of people, this happens so frequently in session in therapy, they'll say things like, I'm just an immediate gratification kind of person. I just always fall for that, whatever is just pleasurable in the moment. So I'm just constantly picking up my phone or going for whatever the easy thing is, and that's why I can't stay consistent with whatever my goals are. If I want to, be more physically active, or I want to, spend less time scrolling through social media, whatever the thing is. But if you listen closely to what you're describing, you start to see that this isn't about like, just somehow finding the raw power to make the right decision in the moment. If you look at the people who excel at the things that you might want to excel at, if you look at the people who are at the top of their field, the people who have really organized lives, the people who are really productive, whatever those things are, the people who excel at those things, in the moment, those aren't really decisions for them to do that thing. You don't have to decide to perform at a high level. You don't have to decide to be productive. You don't have to decide to go for the healthy thing over the non-healthy thing. That's the life that they have. They just do those things. And so for you to have that life, you just are building that around you. You're building that life into place. And once you have that life, it's no longer a struggle or a thing you have to think through to say, am I going to do this or am I not going to do this? For the most part, all of us we tie our shoes every day kind of people. We brush our teeth in the morning kind of people. I don't have to decide, is today going to be the day that I'm going to do those things? That's a given. I'm just going to do that. Like I was saying earlier, I like to make sure I have a really good breakfast, because I kind of know I'll get busy throughout the day, and I might not have lunch or might not have a good lunch, and then who knows how tired I am by dinner. But I know that I could definitely make room and time for a really good breakfast, and I have all the different food groups, and I have all the things that I like that make me feel good and feel healthy. And I also like to make sure I get some time outdoors. So I go for a walk nearly every morning or whenever I can. And at this point, those things don't feel like decisions. It doesn't feel like I have to drag myself to go do those things, though some mornings are colder than others, or maybe I'm craving something unhealthy over something healthy. But as far as I'm concerned, that's just what I do. And even though that wasn't always what I did, now that's just the life that I have. I don't have to think about those things. That's what's next. I woke up, and so now that's what I do.
Yeah, I think there's the word that's coming to my mind is power, right? There's real power. We can either give power to the screens or the devices or whatever it is, or we can say, I'm the kind of person who is a powerful person, and we can put pieces in place that help us to kind of harness the power. One of the things I think that we regularly come back to in solution-focused therapy is that all of the strength, all of the ability that you need, you have within you. Yeah. You just need to harness it, right? It's like, if you think about people who have done amazing feats, right? Somebody who's climbed Mount Everest. Yeah. The ability to do that was in them. Maybe they needed to practice, maybe they needed to go on other hikes, maybe they needed to learn how to breathe differently. But the ability to do that was in them, and they harnessed that ability. If we think about people, maybe not something physical, but if we think about, something mental, somebody, we know people who memorize like large quantities of information, and you think, how do they possibly do that? Well, the power to do that was in them. They utilized the skills, they utilized, the practice, and they became the kind of person who could retain all of that information. And so I think that's one of the things about addiction as well, is that we can either view ourselves as powerless, or we can view ourselves as powerful. And the way that we view ourselves changes the decisions that we make. It changes how much we practice. It changes how much energy or effort or determination we put into a particular thing, right? If I'm a powerful person and I want to stop playing video games, then I do things to prevent myself from being able to do that, or I make other choices. And so I don't want to say that it's like sheer willpower, but I think it's catching the vision of who you are, what your capabilities are. And when you live consistent with your capabilities, it's no longer willpower. It's a simple decision of, well, that's inconsistent with the kind of person that I am.
Yeah, it sounds like we've found ourselves back to where we started, where you said first you got to just believe that this is possible, that a change is possible for you. I think that's so true. It almost, from a distance can sound like a catch-22 type thing of people who are successful at the things that they want to do, people who live these lives that we idealize, see themselves as people who can do those things, and they believe, tomorrow I'm going to do this thing. I'm very well capable of that thing. And I think all points on that circle are necessary ingredients in being that kind of a person. So I think, conversations like this are inviting people from the outside who say, I can't fit into that circle. I'm not that kind of a person. That all you have to do is see yourself in this kind of a way. And here's how you do that. Here's how you start to really let those things stick to you and let that version of yourself feel like it's possible to breathe, possible to really exist.
Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add is sometimes with addiction, and again, it kind of goes along with what we were talking about before, we put it into all or nothing. Either you're clean or you're dirty. Yeah. Either you're using or you're not. And one of the things that I would say is that one of the important components of solution-focused therapy too is construction, right? And we can either view one-time use, or we can view that as a relapse, or we can view that as evidence that I'm getting better. This time I went 3 days without engaging in this behavior or without using this substance, and so now that's a mark of success. I made it longer than I've ever made it before. And so now this next time I'm going to shoot for 4 days, or I'm going to shoot for 8 days, or whatever it is. So we can either view that as a mark of success, a milestone in where we're going, or we can view it as a setback or even an eraser of all of the progress that we've made. And now that just verifies you are indeed the version of yourself that could never succeed. And so I think that's one of the things that all or nothing thinking and thinking about making meaning of what these moments entail, I think that's a really, really important thing. And again, I think that either contributes to our power of look at how far I made it this time versus now I'm back to square one. That you can hear even in that, like I'm either harnessing power or I am void of power.
Yeah, I think that is a really powerful tip on perspective, because there's almost always, not even almost, there's absolutely always a way to look at the movement that you're making that could give yourself the most possible credit. And oftentimes people overlook some of those things. Oftentimes people are seeing it as, it's black and white, and since I'm not fully on that side, I'm going to have to say that I'm losing. I'm fully on this side over here. I'm doing it wrong. I am this kind of a bad person. And not to open up a whole jar here at the end, but I do think those associations, I'm this kind of a person, I'm potentially a bad person in association with not being able to make good behavior choices. That's what kind of keeps people down when they start to see that. But if they can shift and look at themselves in this kind of way and give themselves the credit, even for what might seem like only something that might be partial credit to them, that could really tip them over into the right direction.
Yeah. Anything else you want to make sure we add?
I don't think so. I think we laid it all out there.
All right, wonderful. Well, hopefully that was helpful to you as we think about screens and screen addiction, right? Screens are a part of our world. They're everywhere at this point. And so really what we're advocating in essence is be responsible. Make decisions that are consistent with the version of you that you want to become. And that will require some forethought to think about, to determine what kind of person do I want to be. And that will require some preventative behaviors potentially. But when you can harness that power of being the version of you that you want to be, then something like a screen kind of loses its allure. And so hopefully our description, our conversation was useful for you. We'd love to hear what you have to think. So put a comment down below. If you know that this conversation might be useful for other people, feel free to share this with them. Let them get in contact with us as well. Let us know what you think of this content. But thanks so much for being here, and we'll see you next time.